Before we begin, take a moment. If you find this story interesting, leave a comment with the number 1 and subscribe to support me. But if it's not quite your style, comment with the number 2 so I can improve and do better next time. Your feedback is my greatest motivation. This was hardly the life I had envisioned for myself, not at 60, and particularly not without Henry beside me. For 4 decades, we shared all aspects of our lives, our residence, our aspirations, and our affection. He had served as my stabilizing force, my buddy, my foremost source of inspiration. Yet upon his death 5 years ago, it seemed as if the world had lost all its vibrancy. After his death, I tried to regain my equilibrium by immersing myself in my painting, aspiring to encapsulate the vitality that previously invigorated my existence. Nevertheless, with each brushstroke, I felt further alienated from my true self. Ultimately, I stopped painting entirely, storing away the easel, canvases, and colors that formerly brought me much delight. I had not interacted with them for years. This is how I arrived at this serene retirement community situated in the hills. It was a picturesque location. Really, a sanctuary of well-maintained gardens, stone walkways, and little refined cottages. However, beauty suddenly seemed far from me, like an echo of something I could no longer attain. I spent my days traversing the gardens or seated by the expansive windows of my home, gazing at the vista that had previously provided me solace. It was only upon seeing Thomas, the reserved groundskeeper responsible for the community gardens, that I felt a resurgence of emotion inside me. Initially, I paid him little attention. He seemed to be in his mid-40s. And although he looked kind, I was not seeking companionship. I convinced myself that I was satisfied to spend my days in isolation, enveloped by reminiscences of the past. I saw him laboring in the flower beds next to my residence. As the weeks progressed, he exhibited a caring demeanor in his handling of the plants, as if he understood their cadence and need for nurture. He proceeded with deliberate intent, his hands skillfully uprooting weeds, sowing new life, and eliciting beauty from the soil. One day, when I sat on my porch with a sketch pad in hand but without inspiration, he halted his labor to wipe his forehead. Our gazes momentarily intersected. For the first time, I saw him not only as a distant figure but as an individual. His stare had a subtle power that evoked memories of someone I once knew. It was Henry, or maybe a manifestation of my own solitude. I had low expectations for our first talk. He was only a gardener, and I was simply a widow traversing the fall of my life. However, that day, a transformation occurred. We discussed the flowers he was cultivating, roses and peonies. He talked with profound regard for the earth and its growth, and despite my inability to recall the names of a few rare blossoms, I became enthralled by his words. From that day forth, I began searching for him on my strolls. We engaged in cordial exchanges and succinct discussions on the weather or the condition of the gardens, but I sensed a connection developing, one that astonished me with its subtle intensity. I had not had such an intense attraction to somebody in years, and it unnerved me. The first occasion I really saw him, actually observed him, was on a brisk day in late April. I took my customary morning stroll around the gardens, appreciating the fragrance of budding flowers and the soft rustling of leaves in the air when I saw Thomas bent over a patch of daisies, his hands immersed in the earth. There was an intriguing quality to his labor that captivated my attention, a kind of tranquil, intentional attentiveness that I had not anticipated seeing in a guy who, by all indications, was only the groundskeeper. I lingered near the rose bushes, watching him labor for a little bit longer. His movements were steady and precise, indicating a profound understanding of the earth that few possess. He was not merely planting flowers but nurturing them, coaxing them to bloom as one might encourage a reticent child to speak. It had been a considerable time since I experienced any spark or desire to connect with another person. Following Henry's death, I had isolated myself, retreating into my art only to discover that even my paintings had lost their vibrancy. However, as I observed Tom at work, I felt a flicker of something I had not experienced in years, perhaps curiosity or possibly something more profound. I approached him, uncertain of my words. When he glanced up and grinned, he offered a modest, courteous grin, but the warmth in his eyes evoked a feeling inside me that I had not experienced in quite some time. "Good morning," I said. My voice sounded peculiar to me since I had been used to the solitude of my own presence. Engaging in conversation with another individual seemed unfamiliar. "Good morning," he said while drying his hands on his trousers. "It is an exquisite day for horticulture, is it not?" "It is," I replied, casting a glance at the flowers. "The invested funds are delightful. My spouse previously cultivated them in our garden. He has a remarkable affinity with flowers." Thomas surveyed the other flowers around my home. "You have a beautiful garden." "It does not belong to me," I said promptly. "I did not plant it. It was here upon my arrival." He nodded, refraining from probing more. However, it was evident he comprehended the significance of my statements. The garden may have been exquisite, but it was not my own. It was a transient beauty, akin to life itself. Since Henry's demise, I had been residing in a state of reflection, and Thomas and I maintained a cordial rapport for several weeks. Each conversation prompted me to linger longer, attentively absorbing his narratives regarding his horticultural endeavors and his experiences in various regions of the country. He possessed a rare patience and composure, typically absent in younger men. His speech was unhurried, devoid of the need to fill every quiet with sound, which I found very commendable. Then I could assert he was unlike Henry, who had been loquacious, always occupying our days with dialogues and ambitious schemes. Thomas exhibited a distinct demeanor. He was more reserved and contemplative. However, there was an allure in his silence, an unspoken depth in his eyes that hinted at profound experiences, possibly even suffering. One afternoon, while I sketched the distant hills from the porch, I observed Thomas tending to the flower beds. He moved with elegant precision, and I recognized how much I had learned to appreciate his presence, even from a distance. It had been a considerable duration since I experienced such solace in another's presence, particularly in the company of a man. Following Henry's death, I had barricaded that segment of my heart, persuaded that love or companionship was no longer destined for me. However, observing Thomas, I found myself contemplating the possibility that I may have been mistaken. An unforeseen tempest altered everything. The weather had been warm and clear throughout the day, but by late afternoon, ominous clouds gathered over the hills, accompanied by a sudden burst of wind and the scent of impending rain. I was seated near the window, seeing the tempest approach. Upon seeing Thomas hastily collecting his tools from the garden, I instinctively grabbed an umbrella and ran outdoors. Upon my arrival, the rain had begun falling in substantial droplets, saturating my attire. I screamed above the wind for Thomas to come inside, and he glanced up, shocked to see me. He paused briefly before agreeing, collecting the last of his equipment and trailing me to the porch. By the time we arrived at the door, we were both soaked. "Thank you," he said, shaking the rain from his hair as he entered. "I did not anticipate the storm's rapid arrival," I said. "Nor did I," he replied, offering him a towel. "You should remain till it subsides. It seems that it will be unfavorable." Thomas acquiesced, receiving the towel as he dried himself. I felt a sense of gratitude. However, it struck me as peculiar to have another person in the home. Since Henry's death, the cottage had been very quiet and silent, suddenly disrupted by Thomas's presence in the living room. The trickling raindrops over the wooden flooring imparted a sense of vitality. I gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you care for a beverage?" He suggested that tea or coffee would be pleasant. His voice kindled as I shifted while making tea in the kitchen. I sensed a growing tightness inside me. It was not unpleasant, rather. It resembled an expectation, a subdued exhilaration that I had not had in years. The rain lashed. The storm's force rendered the air within the home dense. As I carried the tea to the living room, with rain pounding against the windows, Thomas stood near the window, observing the rain. He turned as I approached, providing a little grin of gratitude as he accepted the cup from my hands. "I typically do not enter others' residences," he said after a pause, his attention shifting back to the tempest outside the window. "I feel more at ease in the garden," I remarked. "On your extensive time spent in the garden, while taking a seat on the sofa, I noted the pleasure of being in proximity to the earth." He nodded, his countenance contemplative, stating that the garden's rhythm is sometimes the only aspect that provides clarity amidst life's chaos. It remains constant. It is tranquil. I comprehended his words fully, as if his sentiments were mirrored in my own heart. After Henry's demise, I had discovered comfort in the predictable patterns of my daily existence, the morning tea, the afternoon stroll, the tranquil evenings observing the sunset behind the hills. However, that comfort had also devolved into isolation. As I sat there with Thomas, I recognized how much I had been lacking for an extended period. We remained silent as I listened to the rain. The storm had disrupted the power supply, leaving the flickering candles on the table as the only source of illumination. A warmth enveloped us, an unarticulated but profound connection. I felt the magnetic pull of his presence, the subtle strength of his companionship. I recognized that a change had occurred between us. "Do you ever long for it?" I inquired, breaking the calm among the group. Thomas remained silent for a minute, his brow sometimes furrowing in contemplation. He acknowledged that, although I had acclimated to solitude, it was more convenient that way. I acknowledged, comprehending everything. He understood his meaning all too well. "I was once enveloped by individuals," I remarked softly. My spouse consistently introduced individuals into our lives, artists, musicians, visionaries. But upon his death, it all ceased. I departed. Thomas directed his gaze towards me, his demeanor becoming gentler. "You have not departed from this location." I was astonished by Margaret's remarks. I was uncertain if it was the manner in which he spoke my name or the authenticity of his expression in his voice, but I felt truly acknowledged for the first time in years. I gazed up at him. And at that instant, I comprehended that the seeming gap between us, which I had sensed for an extended period, was not as extensive as I had believed. "I am uncertain whether I can return," I murmured, my voice quivering under the burden of my feelings. "I am uncertain if I comprehend how." Thomas approached, extending his hand to delicately brush my arm. Understanding the manner in which I said it is unnecessary. "You only need to take the first step." I gazed up at him, my heart racing. The atmosphere was laden with the tension of unexpressed longing, a connection that had been subtly developing over the preceding weeks. I sensed it in his gaze, the warmth of his hand on my arm, and the instinctive response of my body to his presence. I moved forward, reducing the gap between us. Our lips touched in a gentle, timid kiss, and in that instant, the world seemed to vanish. There was no storm, nor past, nor future, simply the profound intensity of the connection we experienced. When we ultimately separated, I experienced breathlessness. My pulse beat with an amalgamation of excitement and trepidation. I had never anticipated feeling this way again, desiring someone after so many years in my aloneness. I now see, while standing with Thomas, that I had erred. He gazed at me, his countenance imbued with both need and hesitation. "Margaret," I said swiftly, silencing him before he could articulate more. I retreated, suddenly inundated by the depth of my emotion. "I need time," I said, my voice just above a whisper. I need contemplation. Thomas acquiesced with comprehension in his gaze. He calmly said, "Take all the time you require. I will be present for the next several days." I avoided Thomas, not because of a desire to evade him, but due to uncertainty on how to engage with him, confronting the events that transpired between us. The kiss had ignited a dormant sensation within me, one I had not experienced in years. And it filled me with trepidation. Whenever I shut my eyes, I felt the warmth, the contact of his lips with mine, the subdued intensity of the bond we had experienced. It was beyond mere want. It embodied the potential for novelty, an experience for which I was uncertain of my preparedness. And the guilt burdened me significantly. How could I experience such emotions while Henry remained an integral part of my being? How could I contemplate moving on or desiring someone when the love of my life had departed? I increasingly wandered through the gardens, seeking mental clarity, yet my thoughts were consumed by Thomas, his gaze and the vitality he restored within me. However, this exhilaration was accompanied by trepidation, the apprehension of vulnerability and the potential loss of another. One afternoon, while seated on a bench overlooking the rose garden, I found my thoughts drifting to Henry. He had always been vivacious and resolute in maximizing every minute. He would have despised my self-imposed isolation following his death. He would have desired that I continue to live and love, even if it included loving another. However, this knowledge did not alleviate the sluggish passage of the days, each one burdened by the weight of indecision. I could not disregard the turmoil that had developed inside me since that evening. The significance extended beyond the kiss, it included everything it symbolized. I had resided in the solace of my sorrow for an extended period, rendering the prospect of experiencing something new and vibrant both exciting and daunting. I avoided the garden where Thomas toiled, apprehensive about my potential reactions upon seeing him. But his presence persisted in my thoughts. I confided in him something I had not disclosed to anyone since Henry's death, a fragment of myself believed to be lost. The aspect that yearned for connection, sought contact, desired closeness, and demanded more than the silent companionship of my own thoughts. Yet, what if this was misguided? What if it were only loneliness deceiving us? My emotions deceived me into thinking this was genuine. I wandered about my cottage, caressing the framed images of Henry on the mantel, contemplating if he would comprehend one day. In a moment of vulnerability, I telephoned my sister, Claire. Margaret, Claire, the only one accompanying me during my sadness, responded after a few rings with her familiar, loving, and soothing tone, acknowledging that it had been some time. "How are you managing?" I hesitated, uncertain of how to articulate my emotions. My hand trembled as I held the phone, and I quietly confessed, "I believe I have done something I cannot comprehend." Claire refrained from pressing me, permitting the silence to linger until I was prepared to continue speaking. "I have encountered someone," I spoke softly, "who has elicited emotions inside me that I have not experienced in a considerable duration." Claire paused momentarily before articulating, "You don't need to be ashamed of that, Margaret. It's been years since Henry passed. You're allowed to feel something again." "I don't know if I can," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "I feel like I'm betraying him. Like I'm betraying everything we had." "Margaret, you loved Henry," Claire said gently. "And he loved you. But that doesn't mean your life has to stop. You still have so much life left to live. And Henry would have wanted you to be happy. I know he would." Her words sank in slowly, like raindrops on dry earth. I had always known that Henry would want me to keep living, to find happiness again. But knowing that and feeling it were two different things. Could I really open myself up to someone new? Was it possible to love again in a way that didn't diminish the love I had for Henry? "I'm scared," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready." "Only you can decide that," Claire replied softly. But don't close yourself off out of fear. Life doesn't stop just because we've lost someone. You deserve to feel alive again, Margaret. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my cottage, thinking about what Claire had said. I had spent so many years hiding behind my grief, using it as a shield against the world. But maybe it was time to let go of that shield. Maybe it was time to open myself up to the possibility of love again. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by the past. I decided to find Thomas. As I walked through the gardens, my heart pounded in my chest, nerves swirling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I had to face him, had to face what was happening between us. When I found him, he was in the rose garden, his hands deep in the soil as he tended to the plants. He looked up when he saw me, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The unspoken question of whether I had come to push him away or to welcome him back. "Margaret," he said softly, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you again." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. "But I needed to think. I needed to figure out what all of this means." Thomas nodded, his expression serious but understanding. "I didn't want to push you," he said quietly. "I didn't want to make you feel like you had to do something you weren't ready for." "I know," I said, taking a deep breath. "But I've been thinking a lot about this, about us, and I realized that I've been hiding behind my grief for so long that I forgot what it felt like to really live, to feel something real." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "And now?" he asked. "And now," I said, my voice steady, "I think I'm ready to stop hiding." For a long moment, we stood there. The weight of our unspoken emotions hanging between us. Then, slowly, I reached out and took his hand, my fingers trembling slightly as they touched his. "I don't know what this is," I said. My voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to find out." Thomas smiled, a small, tender smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "So do I," he said softly. We stood there for a while, hand in hand, the late morning sun casting a warm glow over the garden. There was no rush, no urgency. Just the quiet understanding that we were both taking a step into something unknown, something that had the potential to change both of our lives. Later that evening, I invited Thomas back to my cottage. The power had been restored, but I had kept the candles lit, their soft light filling the room with a warmth that mirrored the emotions swirling in my chest. As we sat on the couch, talking quietly, I realized that this was more than just attraction. This was a connection, a deep unspoken bond that had grown between us over the weeks. Nurtured by our shared experiences, our shared loneliness. At some point, the conversation fell away, and we found ourselves sitting in comfortable silence. Thomas reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle and careful. I felt my heart quicken, but this time I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, allowing myself to feel the warmth of his hand against my skin, the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You're beautiful, Margaret," he whispered, his voice soft and sincere. I closed my eyes, letting his words wash over me. It had been so long since I had allowed myself to feel beautiful, to feel wanted. But in that moment, with Thomas by my side, I felt alive again. We kissed. And this time it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was full of the promise of something new, something real. As we embraced, I felt the last of my reservations melt away. I had spent so many years guarding my heart, afraid to let anyone in, afraid of what it might mean to feel again. But now, in Thomas's arms, I realized that love wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, something to cherish. That night, we shared more than just a kiss. We shared a moment of true intimacy, a connection that went beyond the physical. It was a meeting of souls, a recognition of the loneliness we had both carried for so long, and a promise that we no longer had to carry it alone. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. The guilt I had felt over moving on from Henry had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance that life, as Claire had said, didn't stop with loss. It continued, sometimes in ways we couldn't predict, and sometimes with people we hadn't expected to find. Thomas and I continued to see each other, but there was no rush. No pressure to define what we were. We spent our days walking through the gardens, talking about everything and nothing, finding joy in the simple act of being together. One afternoon, as we sat by the window watching the sunset over the hills, I realized that I had found something I hadn't known I was looking for. It wasn't just love, it was a sense of peace. A sense of being exactly where I was meant to be. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, I turned to Thomas, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "I think I'm ready," I said quietly. "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice soft. "To paint again," Thomas smiled, reaching out to take my hand in his. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Together, we walked to my old art studio, the place that had once been filled with color and life. I hadn't stepped foot in it since Henry died, but now, with Thomas by my side, I felt a new sense of purpose. I picked up a paintbrush, the familiar weight of it in my hand comforting, and dipped it into the paint. As the brush touched the canvas, I felt a surge of emotion, joy, hope, and love. It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about embracing the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. And as I painted, I knew that I wasn't just rediscovering my art. I was rediscovering myself.